YouTube. All right, so I just wanted to make a quick video on the caravan that's making its way through Central America. Now, of course, Trump, not knowing anything, is making up all kinds of bullshit lies and talking all kinds of stories about the reason why the caravan's happening. He's blaming Democrats, pushing for open borders, George Soros, all kind of crackpot bullshit. And of course, like with everything, it's because he has no understanding of the issues and he doesn't care to understand the issues. And of course, the right wingers are eating it up because they just want an excuse to, hate people and blame them for the problems that they're having, but they don't actually want any real solutions to the problems. So let me actually tell you what actually is driving the caravans. All right, so basically, in a nutshell, you can go research this. What we're witnessing right now is the result of decades of colonialism, one, two, decades of foreign interference, three, the IMF's monetary policies, and four, the drug wars, and then five, climate change. So, unlike England, France, and other European nations, these countries um, weren't given weren't given a chance to have an economy that evolved over hundreds of years. What ended up happening is these countries were taken over by colonial powers who destroyed um, their indigenous races and created an economy centered around one product. So, in the case of like Jamaica, for instance, it was sugarcane. Now, what ended up happening is a lot of these nations ended up having revolutions to get freedom, right? So now you have a situation where you just overthrew your home country, which is great. You're now free, but you now have an economy that's dependent on one product that you no longer have a buyer for. That combined with the reaction from the rest of the world towards newly um, free nations of putting embargoes on them out of fear that their revolution would end up spreading to their colonies. You get how that game works? So my country overthrows England, but now I need to sell my sugarcane since England isn't going to buy my sugarcane now. So I turn to France to try to sell them my cane. France doesn't want to buy the cane. France doesn't want to buy it. Germany doesn't want to buy it. Holland, etc., doesn't want to buy it because they're afraid that if I succeed, then their colonies will follow my example. So that's the very first problem. The second problem is the Cold War. What ended up happening was Russia and the United States started using Latin America, South America, and the Caribbean as a place to wage a proxy war against each other. Um, these countries, after getting freedom, were immediately plunged into an economic disaster because of what I just stated before. So, very, very, very populist leaders with solutions like, hey, I'm going to provide for healthcare. I'm going to help the sick, the needy, the old. We're going to have free education and all of this stuff. These people became very, very, very popular and would easily win these elections. Well, that created a problem for the United States because they were afraid of creating another Cuba so close to their borders. And whenever you'd have a very, very populist leader coming up in the ranks, they would immediately, and especially if they were pushing for some socialist principles, they would immediately assume that they were going to go communist. And under Reagan, especially, the CIA implemented a very, very, very aggressive campaign of trying to undermine these nations through pressure tactics, um, policies like Operation Cobra, embargoes, coups, etc. Right? So now you've created an environment where you're creating one product that you can't sell to anybody, that you're not even allowed to even find a buyer for your product. And now you're constantly having to deal with your democratically elected leaders. getting overthrown, so it breeds distrust for the system and for politics and for justice itself. Now you have all kinds of strongmen who could get in power, and military dictators, like in the case of Panama, etc., gaining strength. Um, so that's basically the backstory. Then on top of that, you had um, um, the passage of the NAFTA Free Trade Agreement. You had the drug wars that came later. And then many of these nations, out of desperation, started turning to agencies like the IMF, like the World Bank, etc., to order to take out loans to try to develop their countries so that they can keep going forward. Well, that created another problem because the IMF's role is not to help nations. The IMF's role is simply to keep currency stable. And they implement a lot of policies and a lot of control mechanisms when you borrow money from them. A lot of it is based on Milton Friedman's economic policies that actually further helps to destabilize and just absolutely destroy this country. You don't have to take my word for it. Look up the history of Argentina and you'll see what these policies have done to that nation. So decades of dealing with this situation, and now we have the issue of climate change, where these countries are being ravaged, absolutely ravaged by category 4, category 5 hurricanes, typhoons that never even make the news, that we never even hear about. These people are going through that stuff on almost a daily basis. They have massive droughts, then they get hit by massive seasons of drought, and then massive flooding. So the unstable weather patterns is also a big part of this issue, because what it's doing is creating water shortages, and it's also creating food shortages in these nations and also driving up the prices. That combined with Wall Street speculation again, fucking with the global grain prices, is also driving up the price of food for these nations. So all of these factors combined is what's creating an environment that's basically unlivable in a lot of these nations. And it's causing a whole generation to be born with basically two options. You either grow up and you go work for the government, or you grow up and you join a gang. Those are your only two choices. Then combine that with just basic racism between, African Americans and other people. Well, not African Americans, like, black people there. Combine all these factors and you create the powder keg in which is what's driving people to try to escape the situation or move north to come to safety. So how do you fix this problem? Well, it's not going to be an overnight solution. As I said, this is something that has been taking place that's been at least 70 years in the making. You're not just going to snap your fingers and solve it overnight. And Trump's solution about sending troops to the borders, that's not going to do shit. It doesn't matter if you send 100 soldiers, 1,000 soldiers, 5,000 soldiers. And it doesn't matter if you start... what are you going to send them there to do? To kill these people? Okay, you shoot these people. You think that's going to stop it? It's not going to stop it. It's not going to stop it. The only solution to these problems is that, one, we need to abolish the IMF. And two, we need to resolve the debt issues that we're dealing with. Especially what a lot of these nations are dealing with. Some of these debts are just going to have to be forgiven and just let go. That's just the way how it is. Three, there needs to be they have to implement a new system of global trade that allows all of these countries to be able to sell their products freely and fairly. A new system of fair trade is the only thing that will solve this problem. And there's going to have to be investment in a lot of these nations to help to rebuild them, so that way their local economies are strong enough to survive. And it becomes a viable place for people to stay in their home countries and make a living. Until we start implementing policies like this refugee crisis is going to get a lot worse. And especially with climate change, it's going to get even worse, because food and all the other issues that I mentioned before are just going to intensify. What do I think's actually going to happen? We're literally going to war with the dumbest people in the country leading us. There is no possible way they're going to make the right choices. The only thing I can suggest is that people who have a positive view and a positive vision, like Bernie Sanders, Alexander Ocasio-Cortez, maybe you watching this video, more progressive-minded people need to actually start winning elections and taking power, and then start implementing new foreign policy choices, changing the priorities that we're dealing with, and actually address climate change. And once we do that over a sequence of years, you'll actually start seeing a lot of changes. And it's not going to be quick. It's not going to be easy. It's not as simple as just send a couple guards and shoot a bunch of women and children. That's not going to solve the problem. That's just going to make matters worse.